Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 in the history of the Christian Church. Today we'll spend a little bit of time reviewing where we have come, taking a look at the Reformation again, and what happened after the Reformation to about 1800, where next week we will take a look at specifically Lutheranism in the United States, and that kind of occurs and begins to develop in the 1700s and 1800s. So first of all, where we have come so far. Where we have come so far is the church, the physical church has stayed unified. In 1054, we have the Great Schism that divides the East from the West. This is known as the Orthodox Church. There are different components of the Orthodox Church. There's the Greek, Armenian, Coptic, and Russian. What's the difference between Greek, Armenian, Coptic, and Russian? The difference is the location in which they are based. So Greek, of course, is the Greek Isles. Armenian is going to be Eastern Europe. Coptic is going to be the church in Egypt and Russia. That one is self-evident. So the Great Schism, if you recall, happens over in a very, very simple way. It happens over the issue of who is in charge, who has the right to establish doctrine, who has the right to enforce the doctrine. And so there's this break between the East and the West. The Western Church has as its headquarters, for lack of a better word, Rome. The Eastern Church has as its headquarters Constantinople. So there is this schism that occurs. The Reformation, of course, happens in the 1500s, and really what that does is it really breaks, not just puts a hole in the dam, but it really breaks down the dam that is holding this rather fragile unity together. And while Martin Luther's desire was to reform the church, ultimately what happened is there was a new church that developed, the Lutheran Church, because Luther found out, and the reformers found out, that the individuals in the church at that time didn't want to reform, didn't want to change, and so the Lutheran Church was founded. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther was very much opposed to the name Lutheran, but that is what stuck. Following the Reformation, there are other groups that begin to develop, and all of these groups develop really over a couple of things. First of all, it's political. As the countries of Europe slowly begin to assert and develop their own independence, there are groups associated with those nations and theologians associated with those nations, and they say, hey, you know what? I don't agree with what the Catholics are saying, and I don't agree with what the Lutherans are saying, so we are going to develop a whole new church body, a whole new church movement. That is the Reformed Church. Again, oversimplification, but John Calvin is a French theologian who lives in Geneva, and in the late middle 1500s, he develops what is called the Reformed Church. There are 5 components that John Calvin espouses to, and you can remember them with the word tulip, T-U-L-I-P. So T is total depravity, U is unconditional election, L is limited atonement, I is irresistible grace, and P is perseverance of the saints. First of all, T, total depravity. That is, we are born in a sinful condition. We cannot, by our own thinking or choosing, decide to come to faith. Unconditional election. God elects us not on the basis of who we are, what we do, or what we don't do. We are elected solely on the basis of God's love and his benevolence. Limited atonement. Limited atonement means that God, through Christ, has only died for the sins of a specific group. Who is that group? The group that God chose. So if you can picture in your mind that believers and unbelievers, the believers here are believers only because God made them believers, that God chose to make them believers and set aside them as his own. And then there's unbelievers. These unbelievers over here, Christ did not die for them. So the limited atonement is Christ only died for the elect. Irresistible grace. God saves us not on the basis of who we are or what we do, but solely on the basis of his love. And P, perseverance of the saints, is once you are saved, you are always saved. So a component that comes from these 5 principles tulip is really God elects some people, he chooses some people, he pays for the sins of some people, but there are other people that God raises up to be condemned. God raises them up to be elected to damnation. So when we hear that, that is just so contrary, I believe, contrary to what the plan is and what God desires for us in our life. When we take a look at the beliefs, I should have said this earlier, when we take a look at beliefs, it's important to distinguish that we are not judging the people. Our desire is not to judge the people that belong to these denominations, that belong to these various groups in Christianity. There are sincere, devout believers in every denomination, and ultimately the Christian church grows and prospers and does wonderful things when every Christian church is growing and developing and reaching out and touching people's hearts and lives. We are not in competition with this church or that church. We are in competition, if you will, with the unbelieving world. And there are enough unbelievers in this world for all of the Christian churches to have their own slice of mission work. So that's one thing I want to just confirm or reiterate, that when I talk about the beliefs of this denomination or that denomination, the purpose is not to judge them. The purpose is to further understand the differences that we might have. So following the Reformation, there are the Anabaptists. You can also see that on the list. What are the Anabaptists? The Anabaptists, really, Anabaptist means opposed to baptism. So that was one of the issues that they had with Luther. They are opposed to baptism insofar as baptism doesn't do anything. It doesn't make a difference if you are baptized or are not baptized in respect to your faith. They do want you to be baptized because Christ says, Matthew 20:18, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father." Paul in Romans 6 talks about baptism. So baptism is important, but it doesn't mean anything for you in your faith. And that group is called the Anabaptists, and today we see them in the form of the Mennonites, Hutterites, and the Amish. What really began to develop following the Reformation, though, is what we have as the Anglican Church or the Reformed Church. From the Reformed Church, we have the present Baptist movement. So the basic tenets of the Reformed Church that developed after John Calvin, the concept of this limited atonement and irresistible grace kind of fell out of favor, but it took on a new element of if you are saved, you need to make a decision to come to Jesus Christ. Baptism is not a means by which God saves us. Baptism is an earthly custom that God desires of us to do, but it is not necessary for your salvation. So it's similar to the Anabaptists, but different insofar as they still believe that baptism is important. That's the Reformed Church, and from that, what we have today as the Baptist Church. The Anglican Church, in the 1500s, the Anglican Church really develops in the British Isles. Henry VIII, a king of England, has a few wives. The Pope says to him, well, I'm not too sure you should be doing that. So Henry VIII says, that's it. I am no longer part of the Catholic Church. I will start my own church, the Anglican Church. So in the 1500s, Henry VIII sets himself up as the ultimate authority in the Anglican Church and establishes his own religious overseer, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we still see that today. From the Anglican Church, there are the Congregationalists, there are the Methodists, and there are the Episcopalians. The Methodists, that is the Wesley brothers. What is a primary thought of Methodism? Methodism developed out of the concept that they felt that Christians were not sanctified enough. So there were specific steps that you needed to do, specific methods you needed to practice in order to be a fully authenticated child of God. And also Episcopalians. So Episcopalians, for a very simple definition, is the Episcopalians are really the Anglican Church in the United States. You see over on the right-hand side, Lutheranism. Lutheranism pretty much stays intact. In Europe, it is when Lutheranism comes to the United States in the 17 and 1800s where the alphabet soup of Lutheranism really begins to develop in all of these different denominations. The Presbyterian Church, you see that also flowing out of the Reformed Church. The Presbyterian Church really centers on the thought of who is in charge. So do we have a central entity in charge? Do we have the local clergy in charge? Or do we have a group of dedicated members who will direct the activities of the congregation? So Presbyterian really comes from the Latin word presbyteritus, which means leaders. So the Presbyterian Church was founded on the principle of the ultimate authority rests in the congregation, not in the office of pastor, but in the office of the elders of the congregation, or the Presbyterians that rule and govern them. From the Presbyterian Church, we have what's sometimes referred to as the Dutch Reformed, the French Reformed, and the Scot Reformed. Again, similar to the Presbyterian Church. What's different, though, is the area in which it developed. As you can see, that the Dutch, French, and the Scottish Isles. Over on the right-hand side, we begin to see the Baptist Church as it comes to the United States. We have the general and particular. Really, those groups develop out of the thought of, or the general Baptists develop out of the notion that they didn't espouse to some of the things that John Calvin said. So specifically, individuals being elected to damnation, perseverance of the saints, once saved, always saved. Those are elements that they did not believe in. From the center then, if you take a look at those yellow squares, the Second Great Awakening is in the 1800s. This is in the United States. The First Great Awakening is about 1730 in the United States. The Second Great Awakening in the United States really is the impetus to which the movement came to abolish slavery. So very devout Christians were very much involved in the abolition movement. Along with that, the evangelism of and the preaching of the gospel in our country. Also in this area, you don't see it on the sheet, but we have the Jehovah's Witnesses, about 1870, Latter-day Saints, 1830, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, and Seventh-day Adventists. What are characteristics of them? At the time, characteristics of them are very much directed on sanctified living, very much directed on your own personal walk, very much directing on these are things that you have to do. And is it bad to focus on those things? Of course not. But it really is a balance that we have in our lives, isn't it? Trusting in Jesus for salvation, but also being responsible for our own individual walk and trusting in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior is the strength and the power and the motivation to live in that manner. All right, so with that, we'll bring it to a close. These 400 years, and takes us to the United States. And next week, we'll take a look at how Lutheranism developed in the United States and the specific areas in which the various denominations developed, and also what brought us to Lutheranism in the United States today. Hope you're enjoying this. Have a great week. See you next time.